There is a place, forgotten by most, where the echoes of the past are not mere memories. They are a stain. A persistent, psychic residue on the very soil. It is a place where the official story is a fragile shield against a truth so dark, it threatens to shatter our very understanding of compassion, of science, and of the human capacity for cruelty. This is not a story of a single monster, but of a system. A machine of neglect, sanctioned by the state, and hidden behind a name that suggested pastoral peace, the Willowbrook State School. According to official records, it opened on Staten Island, New York, in 1947. A sprawling complex of red brick buildings, conceived as a state-of-the-art facility for children with intellectual disabilities. It was meant to be a refuge, a place of care and specialized treatment. A promise made by a society to its most vulnerable. But promises, like buildings, can crumble. And within a decade, Willowbrook would become a byword for hell on earth. The first cracks in the facade appeared not in screams, but in whispers. A concerned parent's letter, ignored. A nurse's aide who quit, her resignation letter citing unbearable conditions. A local politician, given a sanitized tour, who noted the strange, vacant silence in certain wards. But these were isolated murmurs, easily dismissed by a bureaucracy more concerned with budgets than with humanity. The truth was that Willowbrook was not a school. It was a warehouse. Designed to hold 4,000 souls, it soon swelled to over 6,000. And in that overcrowding, a darkness began to fester. The descent was gradual, a slow, sickening slide into the abyss. Funding was slashed. Staff, underpaid and overwhelmed, grew callous, or simply vanished, their posts left unfilled. The children, many of them nonverbal, had no one to speak for them. They became numbers in a ledger, bodies in a space. The initial mission of education and rehabilitation was quietly abandoned, replaced by a single, grim objective. Containment. It was in this toxic environment of neglect that the first, truly chilling chapter of Willowbrook's history began. A chapter written not with mere indifference, but with deliberate, scientific intent. In the late 1950s, a young, ambitious doctor named Saul Krugman arrived at Willowbrook. He was a virologist from New York University, and he saw in the overcrowded wards not a tragedy, but an opportunity. An unparalleled laboratory. Hepatitis A was rampant in the institution. A disease spread through filth and poor sanitation, it was a symptom of the very neglect that defined Willowbrook. To Dr. Krugman, this was a chance to study the virus in a controlled setting. He proposed an experiment. He would deliberately infect newly admitted children with the hepatitis virus. The goal, he argued, was noble, to understand the disease's progression and, ultimately, to develop a vaccine. According to the documents filed with the state, parental consent was obtained. But what did that consent mean? The forms were complex, couched in medical jargon. Many parents were desperate, uneducated, told that this was their child's only chance of admission to the overcrowded facility. They were presented with a devil's bargain: allow your child to be part of a medical study, or watch them remain on a waiting list for years, with no care at all. It was consent born of coercion, a signature extracted under duress. The experiments began. Children, some as young as 3, were fed extracts of stool filtrate from infected patients. They were injected with purified virus. They were housed in a separate, isolated ward, dubbed the hepatitis unit. Official reports speak of meticulous observation, of blood draws and data collection. They do not speak of the children's terror as they were force-fed a substance that would make them violently ill. They do not describe the fevers, the jaundice that turned their skin a sickly yellow, the unending nausea. These were not patients. They were human test subjects. For over a decade, these experiments continued. Krugman and his team published papers, presented findings, and advanced their careers on the backs of these innocent, institutionalized children. They argued that since the children would likely contract hepatitis anyway, they were merely accelerating the process for the greater good. It was a perversion of medical ethics, a chilling justification that echoed the darkest experiments of the previous decade. The Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, had been shredded in the name of progress. But the horrors of Willowbrook were not confined to the hepatitis unit. The experiments were merely the most clinical expression of a rot that infected every corridor, every day room, every moment of existence within those walls. The stench was the first thing that hit you. A thick, suffocating miasma of unwashed bodies, soiled bedding, and disinfectant that failed to mask the decay. The sounds were next, not the sounds of children playing, but a cacophony of moans, whimpers, and occasional, sharp screams that were quickly silenced. The wards were vast, open spaces, crammed with cribs and beds. There were no toys. No personal effects. No color. The children, stripped of their names, were known by numbers or, worse, by their conditions. The feeders. The screamers. The ambulatories. Many were naked, their skin caked in filth. They were left for hours, days, in their own waste, leading to painful, blistering sores. Food was slopped into troughs, and those who could not feed themselves went hungry. Dehydration was a constant, deadly threat. Staff brutality was systemic, a dirty secret everyone knew and no one stopped. Children were hit, slapped, and shoved as a matter of course. More creative punishments were devised for those deemed difficult. They were tied to their cribs with thick leather straps, left for so long that their limbs would atrophy. They were placed in seclusion rooms. Dark, padded cells, for days on end, their only human contact the hand that shoved a tray of food through a slot in the door. There are accounts, from later whistleblowers, of children being hosed down with freezing water, of being forced to fight each other for scraps of food for the amusement of the night staff. The most profound horror was the sensory deprivation. Deprived of stimulation, of love, of basic human touch, the minds of these children retreated into themselves. They rocked. They banged their heads against the crib bars until their foreheads were a mass of scar tissue. They chewed on their own hands and arms. They developed what psychiatrists call stereotypies, repetitive, purposeless movements, a physical manifestation of a soul screaming in a vacuum. They were being systematically unmade, their personhood erased not by a single act of violence, but by 10,000 acts of neglect. And then, in 1965, a light was shone into this darkness. A young reporter for the Staten Island Advance named Jane Curtin, acting on a tip from a former employee, managed to sneak into Willowbrook. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. She did not rely on official reports or sanitized tours. She saw the truth with her own eyes. Her subsequent series of articles, bluntly titled "The Tragedy of Willowbrook," detonated like a bomb in the public consciousness. She wrote of children, living in their own excrement, of the smell of filth and disease, of a scene of squalor and degradation unimaginable in a civilized society. Her words were stark, unflinching, and undeniable. The shield of bureaucracy was shattered. Public outrage was immediate and fierce. But the institution, and the political machine behind it, was a beast with deep roots. There were denials, of course. Excuses about funding, about the challenges of caring for such a population. The official response was one of damage control, not of contrition. They promised investigations. They promised reforms. But the wheels of justice, it seemed, were rusted in place. The real turning point came 3 years later, in 1968, when a television journalist named Geraldo Rivera, then a young, crusading reporter for WABC-TV, used curtains work as a blueprint. He knew that words could be dismissed, but images could not. He and his cameraman, using a stolen key, entered Willowbrook undercover. The footage they captured is some of the most devastating ever broadcast on American television. The shaky, black-and-white images said more than any report ever could. It showed the naked, listless children. The barren, filth-encrusted wards. The vacant, hopeless eyes staring out from metal cribs. The nation watched, horrified, as Rivera walked through this nightmare, his voice a mixture of fury and profound sorrow. The public could no longer look away. The whispers had become a roar. The exposé forced the state's hand. A landmark class-action lawsuit, New York State Association for Retarded Citizens versus Rockefeller, was filed, alleging unconstitutional and inhumane conditions. In 1975, a consent decree was signed, mandating sweeping reforms and a drastic reduction in the patient population. Willowbrook, as an institution, was finally doomed. But what happened next defies logic. As the school began its long, slow process of closure, a new, more sinister mystery began to emerge from the shadows. It concerned the fate of the children who had simply vanished. The record-keeping at Willowbrook had always been chaotic. But as investigators and advocates began to piece together the lives of the residents, they found disturbing gaps. Children who were admitted were never discharged. Their files simply ended. No death certificates could be found. No records of transfer to other facilities. They were listed as absent without leave, an absurd designation for a severely disabled, non-ambulatory child. Some former employees, finally free to speak without fear of reprisal, told unsettling stories. They spoke of midnight transfers, where certain children would be quietly removed from their wards in the dead of night. They spoke of a particular doctor, a shadowy figure who was not on the regular staff, who would arrive unannounced and select specific children for specialized testing. These children were never seen again. The most persistent and chilling theory involves the medical research that had always been at Willowbrook's corrupt heart. The hepatitis experiments were the ones we know about. But what of the others? Conspiracy theorists and some serious researchers point to the high number of autopsies performed on Willowbrook children. Brains, organs, and tissue samples were routinely harvested and sent to various medical research facilities across the country. Was Willowbrook not just a prison and a laboratory for the living, but also a farm for biological specimens? Were the missing children those whose entire bodies were dismantled for science, their parts scattered to universities and research institutes, their very existence erased from the official record? Then there are the architectural anomalies. During the slow demolition of the Willowbrook buildings in the following decades, construction crews made bizarre discoveries. Sealed-off rooms in the basements, not on any blueprints, containing rusted medical equipment of unknown purpose. A network of narrow, subterranean tunnels connecting the buildings, some of which showed signs of use long after the upper wards were abandoned. Whispers among urban explorers who illegally infiltrated the decaying site spoke of finding old, stained restraints in these tunnels, and on one occasion, a small, hidden chamber containing dozens of tiny, unmarked shoes. The official explanation for the missing children is bureaucratic incompetence. Lost paperwork. Fires that destroyed records. It is a convenient, placating answer. But it fails to account for the sheer scale of the discrepancy, or for the haunted looks in the eyes of those who worked there and still carry their secrets. Willowbrook finally closed its doors for good in 1987. The land was sold, and the campus of the College of Staten Island now stands upon much of it. Students walk to class, laughing and talking of their futures, unaware of the soil beneath their feet. The red brick buildings that remain have been repurposed, their halls now filled with the sounds of learning, not of suffering. It is an attempt at redemption, a laying of new memories over old wounds. But some wounds never fully heal. They linger. To this day, former residents and their families speak of the Willowbrook look, a distant, hollow-eyed expression born of profound trauma. They talk of the ghosts. Not the specters of popular fiction, but the lingering presence of stolen potential, of lives unlived, of a truth that was never fully uncovered. The story of Willowbrook is not a closed case in a history book. It is a cautionary tale that echoes in the present. It asks us how easily a society can abandon its most vulnerable. It demonstrates how a noble goal can be twisted into a monstrous act under the guise of progress. It forces us to question who we trust, and the systems we build. The experiments ended. The institution closed. The lawsuits were settled. But the questions remain, hanging in the air like a chill in a sunlit corridor. What was the true, full purpose of those hidden rooms? Where did the missing children go? And if the official story is a lie, how deep does the darkness go? The buildings are gone, but the whispering remains. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night on Staten Island, beneath the modern sounds of progress, you can almost hear it, the faint, collective echo of 6,000 stolen voices, still waiting for an answer that may never come. Part 2, The Architect of a Nightmare. To understand how Willowbrook descended into such profound darkness, one must look beyond the crumbling walls and the overworked staff. One must examine the philosophical architecture upon which it was built. The roots of Willowbrook's horror stretch back to the early 20th century, to a popular and pernicious social movement known as eugenics. Eugenics was the pseudoscience of improving the human race by controlled breeding. It championed the idea that intellectual disabilities, mental illness, poverty, and even criminality were hereditary traits, passed down through inferior bloodlines. Its proponents, who included some of the most respected scientists, doctors, and politicians of the era, advocated for policies to prevent these undesirables from reproducing. According to official state records from the 1910s and 1920s, institutions like the one planned for Willowbrook were not conceived solely as places of care. They were, in part, designed as holding pens within a larger eugenic framework. The goal was segregation, to remove these individuals from society, to separate them from the general population, and in many cases, to sterilize them, ensuring their defective genes would not be passed on. The very language used in the planning documents is chilling, referring to residents as inmates and defectives who posed a menace to the social order. This was the ideological poison seeping into the foundation of Willowbrook long before the first brick was laid. The children sent there were not seen as children. They were seen as problems to be managed. Mistakes of nature to be hidden away. This dehumanization was the necessary precondition for everything that followed. It is far easier to neglect, abuse, and experiment on a number than it is on a human being with a name, a face, and a soul. The man who would become the public face of Willowbrook's most infamous chapter, Dr. Saul Krugman, did not operate in an ethical vacuum. He was a product of this system, and he exploited its inherent dehumanization. His hepatitis experiments, which began in the late 1950s, required a specific, vulnerable population. He found it in Willowbrook. The process of enrollment into the hepatitis unit was a masterclass in bureaucratic manipulation. Parents, often at their wits' end, would be approached not by a sinister figure, but by a respectable, white-coated physician from a prestigious university. He would speak of a new, cutting-edge program. He would explain that their child, by participating, would receive superior care, better food, and closer medical supervision in a clean, separate ward. It was a powerful lure for parents who knew the horrific alternative. The consent forms they signed were pages long, filled with complex medical terminology. The word experiment was often buried. The method of infection, being fed the stool of infected children, was euphemistically described as an oral administration of a purified agent. Many parents, trusting the authority of the doctor, signed without fully comprehending the grotesque reality of what they were authorizing. Some were explicitly told that admission to Willowbrook itself was contingent upon their participation. It was an offer they could not refuse. Inside the hepatitis unit, the children were treated as living petri dishes. The experiments were methodical, cold, and meticulously documented. In one series, children were given gamma globulin, an antibody-rich blood product, to see if it would provide short-term immunity. Then, they were deliberately infected. In another, they were infected with a supposedly milder strain of the virus to see if it would confer lasting immunity, a dangerous gamble with a child's life. Krugman's own published papers detail the clinical course of the disease in his young subjects. He notes the incubation periods, the peak of the fever, the levels of bilirubin in the blood indicating jaundice. What the papers omit is the human cost. They do not describe the child, known as Subject 42, who became so violently, unceasingly ill that she had to be placed in restraints to prevent her from tearing out her own fore. They do not mention the toddler, Subject 17, whose jaundice was so severe he glowed an eerie, ghostly yellow under the ward's fluorescent lights, his small body racked with pain he could not understand or articulate. The scientific community, for the most part, accepted this research. Krugman was lauded for his work. The ends, it seemed, justified the means. The ethical questions were brushed aside with the same justification Krugman used himself: these children were destined to get hepatitis anyway. But this was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The disease was rampant because of the state's criminal neglect of the institution. The doctors were exploiting a condition they, and the system they worked within, had helped to create. The hepatitis unit was the most documented, but it was not the only site of experimentation. Whispers persisted of other, less formal studies. Aides reported that in certain wards, food would be deliberately withheld to study the effects of malnutrition. Children with epilepsy were taken off their medications to observe the frequency and severity of their seizures. These were not sanctioned, published studies. They were the ad hoc, cruel curiosities of a medical staff operating with godlike impunity in a place where there were no consequences, no oversight, and no one who cared to look too closely. The legacy of Krugman's work is a dark stain on medical history. While he and his defenders argue that his research ultimately contributed to the development of the hepatitis A and B vaccines, the ethical price was astronomical. He demonstrated that in the right environment, with the right justifications, the most vulnerable members of society could be used as laboratory animals. The Willowbrook experiments became a textbook example of ethical failure, a case study taught in medical and bioethics classes to this day as a warning of what not to do. But for the children who survived the hepatitis unit, there was no academic debate. They returned to the general population of Willowbrook, often weaker and more traumatized than before. They carried not only the psychological scars of institutionalization, but the physical memory of a disease that had been intentionally, scientifically inflicted upon them. They were living testaments to a pact made between the state and science, a pact that sacrificed their childhoods on the altar of progress. Part 3, A Day in the Abyss. To comprehend the scale of the tragedy, one must move beyond the specific horror of the experiments and into the mundane, daily reality of life for the 6,000 souls trapped within Willowbrook. This was a world governed not by clocks or calendars, but by an endless, grinding cycle of neglect. The day began before dawn. The night staff, skeletal and exhausted, would begin their final rounds. In the dim half-light, they moved through the wards, a sea of metal cribs so close together that they touched. The sound was a low, constant drone, the hum of rocking, the wet slap of a head against a barred crib side, the occasional, sharp cry that was quickly swallowed by the general din. The morning routine was an assembly line of misery. The aides, too few in number, would work with brutal efficiency. Children who were incontinent were ripped from their soiled beds. They were not gently cleaned, they were hosed down with cold water from a large industrial sprayer, a device more suited for washing down a barn floor than for bathing a child. Their skin, raw from constant exposure to waste and moisture, would chafe and bleed. Diapers, if they were used at all, were rough, institutional cloth that was rarely changed. Then came feeding time. This was not a meal, it was a logistical nightmare. In the higher functioning wards, children who could feed themselves were given a tray of lumpy, unidentifiable food. They ate with their hands, or with spoons that were in short supply. In the wards for the more severely disabled, the feeders, the process was even more dehumanizing. Aides would move down the rows of cribs, forcing spoonfuls of pureed food into mouths, often at a rapid, assembly line pace. Children who choked or refused were forced. Food was often spilled, matting in hair and on clothing, adding to the pervasive stench. Gagging and vomiting were common. The vomit would mix with the ever-present filth on the floors. There was no time to clean it properly. The aides had to move on. The schedule demanded it. After the feeding, the children were left. For hours, they had nothing to do. There was no school. No therapy. No play. The windows were often too high to see out of, offering only a view of the sky. The walls were bare, institutional green, stained and peeling. The children retreated into the only world available to them, the interior world of their own minds. They rocked. They flapped their hands. They picked at their skin until it bled. They chewed on their own lips and tongues. They developed complex, repetitive rituals, tapping a wall a certain number of times, arranging bits of lint in a specific pattern, tiny islands of order in an ocean of chaos. These behaviors, known as institutionalism, were not symptoms of their original disabilities. They were wounds inflicted by the environment. They were the psyche's desperate attempt to cope with an unbearable reality. The staff, perpetually understaffed and underpaid, were not monsters by nature. Many started with good intentions, but the system broke them. They were faced with an impossible task, to care for hundreds of profoundly disabled children with no resources, no support, and no hope of improvement. The burnout rate was catastrophic. The ones who stayed often did so because they had no other options. To survive the emotional toll, they built emotional walls. They stopped seeing the children as human beings and began to see them as tasks, as problems, as animals. This dehumanization was the catalyst for the abuse. A child who cried too much might be slapped. A child who rocked too violently might be tied down. A child who smeared feces might be locked in a seclusion room. These were not acts of sadism, in most cases, they were acts of brutal, pragmatic crowd control. The primary directive was to maintain order. Comfort, compassion, and dignity were luxuries the system could not afford. The seclusion rooms were the ultimate tool of control. They were small, padded cells, devoid of light and sound. A child would be thrown inside, the heavy door slamming shut, plunging them into absolute blackness. They might be left there for hours, for a day, for a weekend. The only breaks were for a hurried feeding. The effect on a developing mind, already fragile, was catastrophic. Some children emerged catatonic. Others emerged more violent and terrified than before. The seclusion room was not a solution, it was a psychological torture chamber that exacerbated the very behaviors it was meant to suppress. Disease ran through the wards like wildfire. Hepatitis, as Krugman noted, was endemic. But so were dysentery, influenza, and deadly respiratory infections. The children, malnourished and weak, had little resistance. Medical care was rudimentary. A child with a high fever might be given an aspirin, if they were lucky. Many were simply left to suffer, their bodies fighting, or succumbing to, illness with no intervention. The mortality rate at Willowbrook was a closely guarded secret, but it was significantly higher than in the general population. Death was a frequent, unremarkable visitor. When a child died, the process was as efficient and impersonal as everything else. The body would be removed quietly, often in the middle of the night to avoid disturbing the other residents. The family would be notified by a form letter or a brief, impersonal phone call. The cause of death listed on the certificate was often vague: cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, complications due to their condition. These were not lies, but they were not the whole truth. The real cause of death was Willowbrook itself. For the parents on the outside, Willowbrook was a source of profound guilt and anguish. Many had been advised by doctors to institutionalize their children, told it was the best thing for them, for the family. They were promised care and education. Visits, however, were often discouraged. The institution was far away, the process was intimidating. When they did visit, they were often shocked by the deterioration in their child. The bright-eyed boy they had left was now a listless, rocking stranger. The happy girl was now withdrawn, covered in bruises she couldn't explain. The staff had ready answers. "He's adjusting. She had a fall. It's part of her condition." Parents, trusting the authority of the institution, often buried their doubts, their hearts breaking as they drove away, leaving a piece of themselves behind in that terrible place. They did not know that their doubts were the first, faint whispers of a truth too horrifying to comprehend. They did not know that their children were not just being housed. They were being erased, one day at a time, in the whispering walls of Willowbrook. Part 4, The Whistleblowers. Every system of oppression, no matter how sealed, contains the seeds of its own exposure. For Willowbrook, those seeds were a handful of individuals who refused to look away, who refused to be silent. They were not powerful politicians or famous activists. They were ordinary people whose consciences would not allow them to participate in the great lie. The first cracks appeared from within. They were the low-level employees, the aides, the orderlies, the kitchen workers, who witnessed the day-to-day horror. One such woman was a cook named Margaret. She worked in the central kitchen, preparing the vast, unappetizing vats of food. Her job was to load the carts that would be sent to the wards. But she began to notice that the food returning on the dirty carts was often largely untouched. She heard the aides talking, joking in grim tones about the conditions. She saw the haunted look in their eyes. Driven by a growing dread, Margaret began to take detours on her breaks. She would walk past the wards, peering through the windows in the heavy doors. What she saw, the naked children, the filth, the violence, sickened her. She tried to speak to her supervisors. She was told to stick to her job in the kitchen. She tried to talk to the nurses. They brushed her off. The system was designed to isolate dissent, to treat it as the complaint of a malcontent or a hysteric. Eventually, guilt-ridden and powerless, Margaret quit. But before she did, she made a phone call. She called the Staten Island Advance and asked for the news desk. She told a reporter, Jane Curtin, that something was terribly wrong at the Willowbrook State School. Jane Curtin was a local reporter, a mother herself. She was initially skeptical. Complaints about state institutions were not uncommon. But something in the cook's voice, the raw, unvarnished horror, convinced her to investigate. Her first official requests for a tour were stonewalled. The administration gave her the standard, sanitized tour, showing her the model wards where a handful of higher-functioning children received basic lessons. Curtin knew it was a Potemkin village. She decided she needed to see the real Willowbrook. Using a contact, she obtained a key to a little-used side entrance. What followed was one of the most difficult experiences of her life. She walked through wards she was never meant to see. The smell was so overpowering she fought the urge to vomit. The sounds were those of a barnyard, not a school. She saw a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, tied to a toilet for hours. She saw another lying in a crib, his face and hands covered in open sores, flies buzzing around him. She saw the crib beds, children so profoundly disabled and contracted that they resembled human pretzels, left to languish in their own waste. Curtin took no photographs, she didn't have the means. But she took meticulous mental notes. She later described the process of writing her articles as a form of psychological exorcism, trying to get the images out of her head and onto the page. Her series, The Tragedy of Willowbrook, ran in 1965. It was a sensation on Staten Island, but the state government, under Governor Nelson Rockefeller, largely ignored it. They issued statements about the challenges of caring for such a population and promised to look into it. It was a classic bureaucratic filibuster. Without visual proof, the story lacked the power to force real change. The whispers had grown louder, but the walls of the institution were still standing. The man who would finally bring those walls down was a brash, ambitious television reporter named Geraldo Rivera. In 1972, Rivera was working for WABC-TV's new magazine show, Eyewitness News. He read Curtin's old clips and was stunned that such a story had faded from public view. He knew that words could be argued with, but pictures could not. Rivera and his producer, Tim Rogan, devised a plan to infiltrate Willowbrook. They connected with a group of activists from the organization now known as ARC. These activists provided them with a key to the infamous Building 6, the ward for the most severely disabled boys. On a cold winter night, Rivera, Rogan, and a cameraman named John Mastronelli drove to the campus. Their hearts pounded as they used the stolen key, slipping into the darkness of the building. The footage that Mastronelli captured that night is etched into the American consciousness. The camera, using only available light, moved through a nightmare. It panned over rows of cribs holding emaciated, rocking bodies. It zoomed in on vacant eyes. It showed a boy, naked and shivering, banging his head rhythmically against the bars of his crib. The audio picked up the moans, the whimpers, the sound of the head hitting the metal. Rivera, his voice a tight, controlled wire of anger and grief, provided a quiet, devastating narration. "This is where we keep the boys," he said, the simple statement heavy with implication. The report, Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace, aired in January 1972. The effect was nuclear. The public, confronted with the visual evidence of the horror, reacted with universal revulsion. The phone lines at the station and the governor's office were flooded. Politicians who had ignored the problem for years suddenly found their moral compass. The story was picked up by national networks. Willowbrook was no longer a local scandal, it was a national disgrace. Rivera's report provided the rocket fuel for the legal and political battle that followed. The class action lawsuit, which had been slowly moving through the courts, was now a top priority. The parents, long silenced and marginalized, found their voices, organized, and became a powerful political force. They held rallies. They testified before the state legislature. They gave a human face to the tragedy. The state, its defenses utterly collapsed by the power of television, had no choice but to surrender. In 1975, the consent decree was signed. It was a landmark victory for disability rights, establishing for the first time a legal right to treatment and education in the least restrictive environment. It ordered the population of Willowbrook to be reduced and the conditions to be radically improved. The era of the massive, neglectful state school was, in theory, over. But the victory was bittersweet. For the whistleblowers, the cost was high. Jane Curtin faced professional backlash and was deeply traumatized by what she had witnessed. Geraldo Rivera, though his career was launched, would forever be associated with the horrific images he broadcast. And for the families, the fight was just beginning. The closure of Willowbrook did not mean the end of their struggle. It simply opened a new, more complex chapter, the fight for their children to have a life in the world from which they had been taken. And it raised a new, unsettling question. If this was what had been happening in plain sight, what other horrors remained hidden in the shadows? Part 5, The Lingering Fog, Conspiracies and Unanswered Questions. With the signing of the consent decree and the beginning of Willowbrook's long, slow closure, the official narrative shifted to one of redemption and reform. The story, as told by the state, was of a terrible mistake that had been courageously corrected. The monster had been slain. But for many, the families, the investigators, the historians who have sifted through the ashes, this neat ending feels incomplete. A lingering fog of mystery and suspicion remains, suggesting that the full truth of Willowbrook is far darker and more complex than the official story allows. The most persistent and chilling mystery is that of the missing children. As advocates and lawyers began the monumental task of reviewing patient records for the court-ordered deinstitutionalization, they encountered alarming discrepancies. The numbers did not add up. According to intake records, over 6,000 children had passed through Willowbrook's doors. But the records of discharges, transfers, and deaths could not account for all of them. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children were unaccounted for. Their files were often sparse, ending abruptly. No death certificate. No transfer order. They had simply vanished from the bureaucratic record. The official explanation was incompetence. The record-keeping at Willowbrook was notoriously chaotic. Files were lost, misfiled, or destroyed in small fires that had broken out in administrative offices over the years. It was a plausible, if negligent, answer. But it fails to satisfy those who have looked deeper. The pattern of disappearances was not random. It seemed to cluster around certain time periods and certain wards, particularly those housing the most severely disabled, nonverbal children. The very children who could not speak of what had happened to them. Some former employees, speaking on condition of anonymity in later years, provided fragments of a more sinister picture. They spoke of a van that would arrive at night, not through the main gate, but at a secluded loading dock behind the power plant. They spoke of children, usually those with rare physical conditions or unusual neurological symptoms, being selected by visiting doctors and quietly removed. These were not the official transfers to other state facilities. These were something else. The staff were told the children were going to special research hospitals or private facilities. They were given no paperwork. They were instructed not to ask questions. This leads to the most disturbing conspiracy theory surrounding Willowbrook, that it served as a farm for human specimens. The known hepatitis experiments were just the tip of an iceberg of unauthorized and unethical medical research. Proponents of this theory point to the extraordinarily high rate of autopsies performed on Willowbrook children. It was standard procedure, often buried in the admission paperwork parents signed, for the institution to retain the right to perform a post-mortem examination. Brains, pituitary glands, organs, and tissue samples from Willowbrook residents were shipped to prestigious medical schools and research institutes across the United States. They were used to study the pathology of Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, and a host of other conditions. While this was not illegal, it was often done without the explicit, informed consent of the parents. The children of Willowbrook, in death, continued to be resources for the medical establishment. The theory posits that for some children, the line between subject and specimen blurred entirely. What if a researcher needed a fresh, living sample of a specific type of brain tissue? What if a pharmaceutical company wanted to test a new, high-risk drug on a closed population? The missing children, the theory goes, were those who were transferred out for terminal procedures, experiments so radical or dangerous that they could not be risked within Willowbrook itself. Their bodies, once dismantled for parts, would be cremated as medical waste, leaving no trace. Their files would be purged. They would become non-persons. Then there are the physical anomalies of the campus itself. As the College of Staten Island began its takeover and renovation of the site, construction crews made puzzling discoveries. They found rooms in the basements of buildings that did not appear on any architectural plans. These rooms were sealed, not with brick, but with newer, flimsier materials, as if they had been hidden in a hurry. Inside, crews reported finding outdated medical equipment that defied easy identification, strange glass contraptions, electrical units with corroded electrodes, surgical tables with unusual restraints. Even more intriguing was the network of steam tunnels that ran beneath the complex. These were common in large institutions, but the Willowbrook tunnels were said to be unusually extensive. Urban explorers who ventured into them in the 1990s, before they were sealed for good, reported finding evidence of habitation, old blankets, discarded food tins, suggesting they were used long after the main buildings were abandoned. In one branch tunnel, sealed behind a collapsed section, an explorer claimed to have found a small room containing a collection of children's shoes, all from the 1960s, all worn and caked in mud. It was a haunting, inexplicable discovery. The official response to these mysteries has been a consistent, polite dismissal. They are the products of overactive imaginations, the state insists. The lost records are a tragedy of poor administration, not malice. The strange rooms and tunnels have logical, if forgotten, industrial purposes. The conspiracy theories, they say, only serve to obscure the real, documented horrors of Willowbrook, which are terrible enough. But this rational explanation feels, to many, like just another layer of the cover-up. It is the final, insidious form of the original neglect, the neglect of the truth. The story of Willowbrook is not a simple narrative of abuse exposed and justice served. It is a story with a dark, unresolved core. We know what was done to the children who survived. But what of the ones who did not? What of the ones who left no trace? The legacy of Willowbrook is a double-edged sword. On one side, it led to a revolution in disability rights, to laws protecting human subjects in research, and to the closure of many similar institutions. It stands as a permanent monument to the necessity of whistleblowers and a free press. On the other side, it stands as a permanent question. It teaches us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we dare believe. That cruelty can be sanitized by bureaucracy and justified by science. That the most vulnerable among us can be made to disappear, both physically and historically. The buildings are gone. The lawsuits are settled. But the whispers remain. They are in the silence of the archived, redacted documents. They are in the unmarked graves on Hart Island where many of the children were buried in mass pits. They are in the haunted eyes of the survivors, now elderly, who still carry the Willowbrook look. The story of Willowbrook is over. But its echo is endless. It is a sound that does not fade, a question that does not die. It asks us, always, what we are willing to overlook in the name of convenience, of progress, of order. And it warns us that the walls we build to hide our monsters cannot always contain their whispers.